Forget Brexit, forget Me Too. We're going to discuss something important, which is the popularity of architects. But the only thing I have to announce is we very sadly haven't got Norman Foster here. He couldn't make it. But we have something just as well, which is Norman Foster's alter ego, Ken Shuttleworth, who worked with Norman 30 years and is closely involved in his big projects, the Gherkin, the Millennium Bridge, the City Hall, and many others. We've got as good as Norman Foster. Welcome, Ken. Thank you very much for coming along. Much appreciated. Now practices on his own. Amanda Levete is one of our leading architects. She specialises in scary buildings. The Media Centre at Lord's, the Selfridges building in Birmingham, the dramatic Lisbon Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology, and most recently the really very exciting new entrance to the V&A in London. Terrific buildings all, and wonderfully controversial. There's nothing controversial about Ian Livingstone, because he's our host. Ian is a property developer. Half his buildings, he tells me, are commercial, half are hotels. He's done a lot of work all around the world, currently involved in a very exciting project in Panama. But I have to say, about 8 years ago, when I was chairing the National Trust, we were having a terrible crisis about what to do with Cliveden. For 20 years, we'd gone from minor disappointment to major disaster. And we were coming down here and having lunch with Natalie and Ian. And I was told, look, it's a very glamorous couple. Is it what Cliveden needs? And we concluded that it was possibly what Cliveden needs, but they were certainly a very glamorous couple. All I can say is it's been a total success. And it has really been very rewarding to have at long last the perfect tenant for Cliveden. So thank you very much to the Livingstones. Now, we're going to try and talk about architects, architecture, the relationship between architects, architecture, and the public. What is the public realm of architecture? And the implications of that for the future of cities. If we get through some of that in some of this time, we'll be doing very well. On the question of popularity, the popularity of a profession is moot. I belong to a profession which is deeply unpopular. Architects, I've discovered, are marginally less unpopular, but still unpopular on the whole. And I wanted just to test out what our panel thought of that. Frank Gehry recently said that 98% of everything designed these days is what he called shit. And that explains why architects are not, on the whole, very popular. And I really wondered why. Amanda, why do you think Frank Gehry said that?
Well, because I think he's right. I wouldn't go as far as 98%, but if you look at any city, I mean, London is my hometown, I would say 80% of the new buildings that go up are poor to mediocre, and there is absolutely no excuse for that whatsoever. There are plenty of very, very good architects. They're just not getting all the commissions that they should.
Ken, you get most of the commissions. Why is that the case?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think there's some great architects in the UK, and we work really hard to try and make things as good as possible. You know, we have architects have a real, very deep social conscience to try and make buildings and spaces and places work for people. You know, it's a balancing act between, you know, what we have to achieve for our clients, what we have to achieve for the public, what we have to achieve for the cost plan. It's always about a balance. It's always about getting that balance right. Sometimes maybe we don't. Amanda's probably right. Some people don't get it right. It goes too far the wrong way. But I think as an architect, we are, you know, deeply feel that we have to get things right for the public. You know, we really do feel that. And I think it's, you know, whether that comes across or not every time is maybe not the case. But I think, you know, all of us, you know, have this sort of deep-seated thing. It's all about people. Buildings are not about edifices or, you know, not about egos. It's all about buildings for people. So that's where I start.
Most architects blame developers.
I think most developers are frustrated architects. They want to produce great buildings. They've got something in their mind that they want to produce. And there is no shortage of great architects. The difficulty is marrying financial requirements, architecture, planning rules, taxes, returns, and everything else. And as a result of it, great architecture often gets watered down. And I think that's why you see not great buildings often produced by competent architects.
Well, let's take concrete examples, because these debates tend to be in the abstract. There are two developments I've studied quite closely in London lately. One is the Battersea Power Station development in Nine Elms, which I regard as a disaster. The other is King's Place, King's Cross, which I regard as a great success. Why are they so different?
Well, King's Cross, I think, is an extremely good example. Argent, who the developer, made a very clever decision up front, which was to put St Martin's Art College right at the centre. It was one of the first buildings that was constructed. And with an art college goes a whole kind of community of young, creative, interesting, entrepreneurial students. And that kind of, that rubs off on a place. They also then made the decision to allow the public to walk, very radical, to walk through the art college 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I mean, it's a really, really interesting piece of planning. And they've worked extremely hard to produce landscaping that is far from the cheapest. It is really well considered. It really works. And the public spaces really work. And what has happened is it's attracted a very wide group of people from around that district and a lot of families. And once you get families into these places, it becomes a safe place and everybody wants to be there. And it's phenomenally successful as a social place, but also as a commercial place, because all the units are now being let, and I'm sure it'll be a huge success.
Would you have rather done King's Cross or Battersea?
I think that I echo what you said. I think that it's a great place to live, and as you say, architecture is about finding places for people to live and work. I think the difference is that Battersea did not have the same kind of canvas to start with. I think it was possible to generate the master plan at King's Cross, given the land holdings and the lack of existing infrastructure there. And I think that what happened at Battersea was that they were constrained again by a lot of planning rules, which made it difficult, plus some bad architecture.
I wouldn't agree, actually. I really think Battersea had a fantastic historic power station, an amazing piece of heritage that you can work with. There was so much space there. They could have done anything they wanted. But I think what was driving the ambition of that development was not social purpose. It was money. It was profit. And you feel it. You just, it doesn't feel an authentic place. And interestingly, it hasn't worked financially. It's been beset with scandals and financial failures. It's
with the wrong team, with the existing piece of infrastructure, it just hasn't worked, I agree.
I think they've both been around for about 25 or 30 years as projects. I mean, I remember working on King's Cross nearly 30 years ago when we had the idea of a park and buildings around the edge.
You did the design for it, didn't you?
Yeah, at Foster's, there's a whole master plan that we did originally for that. That was 25 years, maybe 30 years ago, before it actually got realised. In that time period, there's loads, going for Ian's point, there's lots of negotiations with various groups, planners, action groups, local groups, heritage groups, everybody, landowners. And it's come out, I agree, I think it's quite successful. And it's all about the people. Battersea, which started about the same time, had this massive power station, which was 100 million just to refurbish it, maybe 200 million to the chimneys as well. And then to pay for all that, they put 18 million square feet on that site, which is about twice Canary Wharf, just to put it in context, to actually pay for that. And I think what's happened is you've got really dense, over-dense, very narrow streets, very tall buildings, no open space. It's the opposite of King's Cross, and it's all to do with that, using that heritage, but probably in the wrong way.
Well, I'm puzzled, because King's Cross had the same conservation problem. You've got to keep the warehouses, you've got to keep the railway, you've got to keep the canal. It was the same sort of industrial heritage they had to cope with. And for some reason, we kind of somehow assume these things just happen, but for some reason the one thing worked and the other didn't. I'm still puzzled as to why it should be the case. I mean, are you saying it's nothing to do with the architects or the visionaries or the developers or what?
I think the architects have had a role to play, but I think at the end of the day, on those sort of projects, you have to make it work financially. And I think the Battersea Power Station site needs to generate a lot more money. I mean, Ian probably knows more about this than I do, than King's Cross did, to actually pay for those developments.
But I think there's a danger in kind of hiding behind constraints, because, yes, the planning process is far from perfect and can inhibit innovation, but the discipline of architecture is all about, for me anyway, is all about dealing with resistance and finding a smart way around these very real constraints. You have to deal with the resistance of history, you have to deal with the resistance of complying with code and budgets, that's part of it. I think we shouldn't hide behind that. We should just find creative ways of being more ambitious.
But who's we in that
Well,
sense?
I'm talking about architects, but I mean developers too, the entire team, the clients, the councils as well. I think what we're missing in the UK is a kind of political leadership that could really make a difference to make cities a better place to live in. And I just want to use two examples that I've come across recently through my work, one in Paris and one in Lisbon. In Paris, the Deputy Mayor for Culture has initiated this really interesting scheme, which you probably know about, Ian, which is they are strategic sites that the city own. They're giving them on long leases to teams that are investor-developer-led, and they are selecting the winning team, not because of the greatest financial bid, but for the greatest amount of content that aligns with their political, social, cultural ambition for the city. So what it means is that the developers are not, that they are having to bring in community groups, community projects, curators who are kind of trying to define the content, because that's part of the bid. So you're getting developers competing against each other, not just about money, but about something greater. And the city are getting rich on the back of it, and these projects are really interesting, really innovative.
Well, that's more or less what happened to King's Cross. But, I mean, Ian, when you start out on a project like that, do you start out with the money, or do you start out with what might be called the people, the cornerly?
You have to have a clear vision of what you're going to build. And I totally agree that what we need is placemaking. The difficulty that we have, particularly in an urban environment, and the planning rules that we get, and I keep talking about constraints because I spend my life dealing with it, but there is virtually nowhere in central London, apart from a few big regeneration projects, that you're not either in a conservation area or constrained by one, or constrained by heights and views and various other things. So it is quite difficult. But we do need placemaking, and we do need a holistic approach by the government, both locally and centrally, to allow us to create great things for us, great architecture and great buildings for our city. Because in isolation, you can't do it.
Now, whenever we have these conversations, we always end up with architects blaming someone else. So before we get on to someone else, which is where Ian's leading us, let's come back to the architects. I can think of 2 or 3 buildings I've lived in or worked in. One was the Economist building in London, one was Barbican in London. Both of them brutalist buildings, which I think fail as city buildings. They're surrounded by walls or spaces, or they're surrounded by coldness. What was interesting about both of them, but particularly the Economist Plaza, just off St James's Street, I imagine most people know it, it was designed to be the humming hive focus for St James's. All the St James's residents would meet in the Economist Plaza. Absolute rubbish. And working in that building, we were told, will you please go down and have lunch in the plaza? People would go out into the street, they'd sit on the pavement, they'd eat in the gutter, they'd do anything but not have sandwiches in the plaza. For some reason or other, it had a magnetic aversion to it. Now, I'm sorry, I can go on about that. I was fascinated by why it was. People, they'd put sculptures there, they'd have exhibitions there, they'd put huge concrete boxes for us to sit on. They'd do everything they possibly could to make you go and have lunch in the plaza. No one would touch it, although it was a shortcut through the site. Now, there are all kinds of reasons we thought why that might be the case. But one thing was for sure, the Smithsons who built it always said, bloody Economist staff won't use the plaza, it's their fault. And now they've redesigned it 2 years ago. There was a huge row about redesigning it. And the great thing was, for goodness sake, bring the plaza down to the ground, put shops in it, do all the kinds of things that might make it usable, or just rebuild the street around it, for goodness sake. As it is, it's listed to the nth degree. They're going to treat it as sacred space. They're going to call it the Smithson Plaza. And they're going to leave it exactly as it was, and it will fail a second time. Because, frankly, the arrogance of the architects is such that they do not believe they've made a mistake.
So we've learned from that, Simon. I mean, if you go to Rathbone Square, which we've just finished...
You haven't learned Economist Plaza, but anyway, go on.
No. Well, the Economist Plaza, some of those developments that haven't worked, we've learned from that over the years. The building we just finished, Rathbone Square, is half the site's given over to the public. It's a big public space. In the middle of that is a garden all in the square. There's lots of planting.
Where's this, sorry?
Rathbone Place. It's just one street behind Oxford Street.
Fitzrovia.
Fitzrovia. And it's got shops and cafes, and it's got residential and offices, all mixed together in one place. It's one of the very few new public spaces, public squares in London for ages. And that's working incredibly well. Facebook have taken the whole office building. It's absolutely packed at lunchtime on the lower ground floor, and it hasn't even been fully let yet. And I think, so that project, and there's a number of others, have actually learned from that. So I think we really feel strongly about creating public space, about creating places. That's what we're trying to do, not just spaces, but places people actually want to go to. And Amanda's building at the V&A, you create a new public place there. It's a fantastic place to go with a great building. So I think there are examples. Economist, I agree, has shortcomings. And it's all about the change in level, to be honest. It's all about change in level.
Well, I think it's easy to criticise the Economist Plaza, and I do agree the plaza doesn't work, but I think as a piece of architecture, it's an extremely important piece of post-war architecture that was very utopian, that has become, is one of the rare pieces of modern architecture in St James, and despite the plaza not working, it feels very settled there. It's almost become loved as part of the kind of ensemble of buildings. So I think, maybe just accept that it's a pause in a piece of pause in the city and not try and animate it. But just coming back to creating public spaces, and I do think there is a greater need for spaces where people can come together than ever we've had before, because we think that we're more connected than ever with the internet, but we're not. As a society, we're more and more disconnected. And I think it's, festivals like this are a great illustration. The popularity of literary festivals, music festivals, people want to be with people. Therefore, creating public outdoor spaces where people can come together has to be at the heart of our institutions, the heart of our cities. So that was very much the thinking when we did the competition for the V&A. And we took a very radical and rather kind of daring move at competition stage, which was to say, because the V&A is a Grade 1 listed building, of course, rightly so, but that we would radically alter the Grade 1 listed Aston Webb screen on Exhibition Road in order to allow people to just drift in the street, to renegotiate, if you like, the relationship between the museum and the street and make it much more open. And that move, although it wasn't immediately accepted by English Heritage, has unlocked the potential of and is contributed to the success of that
But it's
project.
heavily constrained by the conservation context in which it's taking place. And I mean, coming back to Ken's point, the number of times when you have a new public space created by modern architecture is minimal.
It's very few.
I mean, it's almost a kind of a disaster area.
Yeah.
And I always think, why are more people in Borough Market every day than there are in the entire Shard?
Yeah.
The answer is they won't go near the Shard.
Yeah.
It's gated, locked, you're painting and what's thing. But anyway, it's a deserted building. Borough Market required no money at all spent in it. It's fantastically popular. And that is replicated right across London, Portobello Road, everywhere. The old bits, like, why are we here in this beautiful building rather than in Reading Station or Exhibition Centre, Birmingham? It's a beautiful building.
It's a character.
And I mean, Ian may object to conservation areas and listed building status. This is a wonderful example of the power of conservation. Yeah, absolutely.
It's about character, isn't it? You're trying to create places which you have a unique character, and you go after Borough Market, you go to Covent Garden, you go to these fantastic places. Because the environment is so good. As a modern architect, try and recreate that it is quite difficult. I mean, at Battersea you did have the power station. At King's Cross, you have got this fantastic station, so you have got things to work with. And I'm with Amanda, we go for the constraints. I quite enjoy the constraints as well. Ian doesn't like constraints, but we love constraints because that's why he has to employ us, because he can't handle them without us. And that gives us, if it was easy, you wouldn't need architects, just get on with it. The fact is this difficult, and we have to, wind our way through different paths, I think is, what makes it really exciting to be an architect, to be honest.
Where we do have a shortage of space in inner cities, it is possible to create great new spaces, but it really needs a lot of thinking, both, as I said, at local and regional level. And if there isn't the budget to build these kind of spaces, then they need to think a little bit more laterally about how to do it. And that may mean giving commercial developers more volume in return for giving up land for public realm. But again, people aren't really wishing. We don't find in our business that local authorities have got that depth of thinking as to have that flexibility to create overall better spaces by pushing the boundaries.
But in the instant, you know, in the projects in Paris that I reference, the developers have adopted now a different mindset. Now, I don't know whether the commercial returns are any less. I suspect they're the same because, you know, they have to make whatever they have to make. But they have taken a different... There are other things than money that are driving the idea, and there are other consultants who are taking the lead. So, you know, the business model follows the design rather than the design following the business model.
It's precisely because the competitions are being run by the city, not by a private sector vendor of the land, just looking for the best bid. And that's the difference.
So it's the same as happening in Sydney, where Sydney are actually, the city are having the competitions. So a developer will have to go to the city, they have a competition run by the city. And at the moment, the developers are getting a bit upset because they're not allowed to actually be on the selection panel to choose the architect, which is causing a few issues, as you can imagine. But there is the same idea, is to try and make the city of Sydney much more, you know, better architecturally. And they have to be international competitions. They can't just be local. They have to go out to the wide world and get a mixture of local architects but also international architects. So again, that sort of city, like Sydney, is trying, in the way Paris sounds like it is as well, to actually encourage, you know, more civic responsibility.
Okay, we're trying to find someone, so to speak, to blame for Frank Gehry's problem. I stood in Waterloo Bridge with an American recently, looking out across London, and they just simply were appalled. They said, "Who on earth planned this city?" And the answer is really no one.
Nobody planned
It's an unplanned city now. Point one, are we happy with that? I mean, we have a democratic government in this country. Are we happy with that? And secondly, really, who is to blame for that? Now, we can nominate 2 or 3 mayors if we want to. But there's clearly something wrong with the relationship between the architect, the developer, the client, and the political process that's delivering, in the case of London, and I may say, in almost all big cities in England now, an unsatisfactory outcome.
Well, I don't think everything's... I think you're taking a quite kind of nihilistic view of modern architecture, and we've talked about some really good examples. And I think also there's a kind of, you know, because of the political uncertainty, the financial and societal uncertainty at the moment, I think there's a new sobriety, and I think we have to really take that as something positive, not to see it as an austerity, but to make the best use of what we've got. And sometimes maybe it means not doing a new development, but repurposing what you have, not being expansionist, but remodeling, reappropriating. But, you know, are architects popular or not? I don't think that's really the question. It's, you know, what can we do to make cities better collectively? And there's just one other example I want to bring up, which is in Lisbon, the then mayor, who I would go and present to for the museum that we're doing. First time I went and presented in his amazing palace in the centre of Lisbon, and it was opulent and fantastic, and I was looking forward to going back a second time. And then the cab took me somewhere completely different, a district that I'd never been to. And I met him, I said, "What's with the palace? Where's it gone?" And he said that this district had received tens of millions of euros, EU money, to try and make it better. There was a lot of crime, prostitution, drug trafficking, and no money made a difference. So he decided to lead by example. So he took his entire office, of the mayoral office, and all the security and all the kind of paraphernalia that goes with that, and moved it from the palace into a converted warehouse in this troubled district. And almost overnight, the perception of this district changed, and so the district began to change. And it was such a simple, clever thing to do. And now someone else uses the palace.
But in a way, that's what City Hall is. City Hall did that. City Hall was supposed to be next to the Palace of Westminster. It's going to be in County Hall, opposite Westminster. And it was Nick Rainsford who decided we need to move it down to the south side of the river, down by Tower Bridge, which was a desert at the time, and build a building that would then attract other people to it. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened. So it moved it east and south. and regenerates that area.
I like the idea of traumatizing cities in that way. I mean, you sort of jolt them into something completely different. But I come back to my original complaint. I mean, almost every big city in England, certainly at the moment, is going to have a huge tower in the middle of it. There's a thundering great tower in Norwich, in Bristol, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Leeds. A huge tower, almost like the Shard. It's crazy. And no one voted for it. If someone had put to the plebiscite or a referendum to the people of London 25 years ago, would you like 100 towers over 40 stories in central London? They would have said no. I'm absolutely sure of it. Well, they're going to get it. Now, that to me is a failure of the political process, quite a serious failure. I don't think any architects refused to build the tower. That's my complaint. Mm-hmm. Where is the resistance going to come from if it doesn't come from people within the property profession?
Well, we've never been asked to build a tower, so I don't have to. I can answer that more easily. But in the case of Lisbon, we did not build as high as we could have done within the code, and the reason for that was so that we could use the design of the building to try and reconcile a city whose part had been cut off from the riverfront. And by keeping it really low and putting the galleries semi-below ground, it meant the views from the city to the river were not impaired, and the views from the other side of the river back to the city were not impaired. So, that we took a position and went down, which was possibly a bit more expensive, but the result was worth it.
But Ken, you've done lots of towers. I mean, have you ever said this tower is much too tall? I want to make it shorter.
We have done that. Actually, the Cube in Birmingham is only 20 stories, which it could have been 40 stories. We chopped it in half. Cool. I think, you've got to think about the market. The City of London, is an incredible international city where everybody wants to be there. And there's a huge pressure to be in the centre of London. They built Canary Wharf to actually sort of take some of the sort of balance out of that when it was getting too much. But people actually want to be in London. They actually want to be in central London. And the moment you had to go to 300 metres. When I was doing the Gherkin, it was only 180 metres. So things have changed in that time period, in the last decade, to go to 300 metres, which is the aircraft limit coming out of Gatwick in the emergency.
So it's only the aircraft that stop you going even higher?
Yeah, it could go higher.
God.
Technically, you can go higher.
I think as cities expand around the world, there are three ways that they can expand. You can either go laterally, which is difficult in terms of communications. You can go vertically, or you can build satellites. And most people don't want to live in a satellite because they don't know if it's really going to work. You've got to have quite a lot of long-term vision and connectivity with the satellite. So if you're going to go vertical, which I think we have to, it's not a question of if, but how, and where. So we have to have a competent planning authority across the city, which we don't really have, that says that we can accelerate growth of high buildings in certain areas, provided that they meet the criteria. And the criteria could be ecological. We may have vertical gardens. We may have different types of vertical transportation. But someone needs to really look at it across the whole city and decide how and where we do it. And at the moment, it's just being decided largely on a local level without a consensus among all the different boroughs.
But London's never had a master plan, which is quite unusual for a city of the size of London. Now, in a way, I think you could argue that its lack of a master plan has been part of its vibrancy. It's evolved and morphed, and new districts overtake others, and it's very alive in that respect. I think the problem with tall buildings is there has been no master plan strategy for where groups of tall buildings should be. And I'm not against tall buildings per se, but I am very against just putting them where, for example, the buildings along the riverfront, absolutely shocking. Most architects, ironically, do their worst work on the river. And yet it's the best place in London. I just don't understand.
There was a master plan, but it was the old GLC one. It was torn up by Ken Livingstone.
I mean, there is no. I mean, Amanda's right. There's no master plan for London. It's basically the market does what it needs to do to make it work. There are constraints of where you can and can't put towers. There's something called the Eastern Cluster, which is a shadow, because you've got St Paul's Dome is protected. You may not know, there's various view corridors around London which protect St Paul's Dome, the view of the drum and the dome. You're not allowed to put anything in front of that or behind that. And that is a constraint, which means you get things what towers in the eastern cluster, as it's called, which is beyond any of those views. So there is a sort of, around the Gherkin, Leadenhall, there's a sort of area where you do get towers in central London. But I think you've got to think about, London is a sort of, Peter Rees described it like a kitchen garden. You've got the sort of layout of the streets, and you plant plants, you grow them, and you knock them down and grow something else. Otherwise, you get Paris, which you have to build La Défense because Paris is completely constrained and you're not allowed to really change it. And Paris is a museum by comparison to central London. And I think you've got to decide what sort of city you want.
Well, I mean, there's a fourth version of what Ian's saying. There is a fourth alternative, which is high-density, low-rise, which is what Paris is and what most big European historic cities are. The normal street in London is 4 or 5 stories, apart from the tall ones. And you've got 4 or 5 stories, then you've got towers. Or you can go 7, 8 stories, like Paris or Berlin. And you don't need towers. It's a choice you make.
Yeah.
And we made the choice to conserve the old terraces. Yeah. And the price we paid is these tall buildings. I just don't think that price was necessary to be paid in that way.
I mean, nobody wants to go to, from a developer's point of view, putting Ian's hat on for a moment, you don't want to go tall. It costs a fortune to go tall. You've got more lifts, you've got more structure, you've got more wind load, you've got everything. It's cheaper to build it, more economic to build it around 8 stories. So that's why all those Kensington, in fact, I think Kensington is still the most densely occupied part of the UK, but actually it's only 8 stories high compared to the City of London, which is much taller. So I think nobody wants to go tall if they don't have to. So my question to people who build in a desert, 100 stories, is why would you do that? Because you've got all this fantastic land around you. You don't need to go tall, except for ego, which we don't have that problem.
We can end this part of the talk on that last statement, except for ego.
Yeah.
I mean, the Shard, Renzo Piano's buildings, these buildings are built for showing off, both by the property developer and by the architect. And there's no constraint on them. That's why we come on to planning.
I think the Shard is an interesting one because that was Ken Livingstone, it was Renzo, and it was Irving Seller. And they were looking for a site to do something tall. But that building uses as much power as Colchester, to put it in context. So if you're living in Colchester and your lights go out, it's because the Shard's using all your energy.
And there's no one in it. I mean,
the reason that building got built was that it was bought by the Qatari government, who wanted to make a big splash in London, and they made a point, and they certainly did that. Whether I very much doubt it'll be an economic success ever. Yeah. If it was a private developer, they would have gone
I regard that
past.
as a public disgrace.
Yeah,
But I may be alone.
You'd probably stop. You'd build half of it, wouldn't you, and forget the top half.
Well, let's move on to insert the last bit, because we're in agreement that something's unsatisfactory here. The general agreement is it's not our fault, it's someone else's fault.
I said it's all of our fault. I
Yeah,
said we
well,
all have to take responsibility.
That's easy, Amanda. We can all agree everyone's to blame. But I think what's to blame is the process called planning, and the relationship between the planning process and politics and politicians, because that's unquestionably what's gone wrong in big English cities. How do you do that? What is the reform that achieves that particular benefit?
I guess we need some kind of independent planning commission for London that looks at what the city needs, and that we need a strong mayor and we need a proper framework, because whatever we do, there will be local groups that don't want it. And that's a fact of living in a big major city. And someone's got to look at the greater good as well as listen to the local concerns, and there is a balance.
Well, you need political leadership, which we don't have, period, and you need political vision, which we don't have. So, and that, I think, if you have that, it begins to inform all of the work of all of the councils and all the different districts. But there isn't anyone who has a big vision.
You could take Manchester. Manchester did have the vision, didn't it? It had Howard, who was there for many, many years, and he had the vision, and he had the drive, and he had the passion to make Manchester into what it is today. And you can judge whether he's been successful or not, but he actually has transformed the city from what it was to what it is today. And that, that power, that, I think he's called the chief executive rather than the mayor, but he had this sort of, he had this sort of power to push Manchester on in a way that
Manchester's a unitary authority, whereas London is a series of authorities, and that's a big difference.
Big difference, and Birmingham doesn't really have this equivalent, and neither does Edinburgh, neither does Glasgow. Howard, I think, was unique as far as I can see.
But the tragedy, he ruled Manchester absolutely, with his council leader. But his way of manifesting his ultimate power was to build this huge, great tower which is going up. I mean, it's bizarre. There was no kind of superior authority. There was no informed debate locally about this. A couple of footballers lend their name to it and some Chinese money, and off it goes. I mean, no other city in the world would behave like that.
But that's what you get when you have, that sort of power in one person, isn't it? But if that's what we're after, then, you're going to get, Maragall in Barcelona, there was the mayor of Barcelona, and he had this similar power. He did different things.
Yeah, but there are other issues that, are just not being really dealt with, like the slow demise of the high street and the death of retail because it's been taken over by the internet. And this is having a massively negative effect on communities. So where is the political initiative to tax Amazon, to stop and to also stop people like Amazon paying huge rents for really kind of substandard space in substandard areas, rents that are 10 times higher than they should be paying, which is preventing the people who own those sites selling them to redevelop for housing or something because the rents they're getting are so high. Now, this just shouldn't be happening.
Well, I mean, cities are market economies. Property will fetch the price the market demands of it. The job of the planner, to me, is to decide what the town should look like. The uses of the buildings will change over time. The one thing will not change is its appearance. And the London I remember as a boy had a certain uniformity to it. As it was beautified, it got really a very beautiful shape to it, I thought. And the GLC policy was to cluster the towers. And that made sense to me. It's what they do in Manhattan, it's what they do in Paris, what they do in Berlin, and so on. Two mayors, Livingstone and Johnson, shot it to ribbons. They never said they were going to do it. They never presented the public. There's never been a plan for these towers. And Boris Johnson said to me to my face, "I will not build any more towers." Guy lied.
Not the first time.
And not the first time. I mean,
What a surprise.
But you're dealing with a kind of almost random politics here.
I do agree with what you said about retail, though. We do need to see vibrant high streets. We do need to see high streets which form part of the community. And the part of the issue with that is not so much the planning process, but it's the fact that they have very, very high property taxes compared to the internet operators that don't. And therefore, if you want a level playing field, it needs central government intervention in terms of retail.
But I worry, Sam, that behind your question is a very nostalgic view of the city that is anti-progress, and that's wrong. We can't, as a society or as a city competing with other cities, we can't just stand still. So, what is your view of the buildings, the new buildings in the city? I think there are some fabulous new buildings in the city. Not all of them are super high. The Lloyd's isn't new, but I mean Lloyd's was a major kind of upset in the way that you model a building. The Gherkin, the Rothschild Bank, the Leadenhall building, that cluster of towers there works, in my view, extremely well. It's an incredibly exciting place to be, and it's incredibly exciting to see those towers from points along the river. It makes me feel a sense of optimism in the future.
Right. I mean, I use the word exciting endlessly there, i.e. visually exciting, I assume. I mean, they are visually exciting. I up to a point accept that. Every single time we've tried to save any bit of old London, we've always had to fight against someone saying, "Oh, you're a fuddy-duddy old nostalgic." Covent Garden would not be there if it wasn't for conservationists fighting that argument. Whitehall would not be there if it wasn't for someone fighting that argument. Right across London, Borough Market I mentioned before, that was going to be swept away by the modernists. All I'm saying is you've got to find a balance. And the language you're using is not the balance. It's the language of totalitarian progress. Now you've got to define what you're saying. You've got to define where the balance lies, and you haven't.
Well, I think what we've done, just using an example of my own work, what we've done at the V&A is an extremely good balance. It negotiates the tension between history and modernity in a way that everybody actually has been very enthusiastic about. The public are using the V&A and the courtyard that we've created in a completely different way. Museum attendance figures at the V&A are up 26% at a time when museum attendance in London is going down. It's extremely popular. It's a less intimidating way of entering the museum, and it just feels part of the street. Now, we took a brave move. We were, you know, the presumption that you don't mess with Grade 1 listed buildings, we challenged that. And yes, the English Heritage said no at the beginning, but what we did, we went away, we reflected, we did not change the design at all. What we changed was the way in which we argued the case, and then we got it through. So call me totalitarian.
One of our jobs was London Wall Place, and London Wall, back in the 60s, they knocked down fantastic old abbey, left a few arches from it, and they put a car park across the top of it. And they put all these tower blocks on the wrong grid, and they ploughed London Wall straight through on a sort of strange grid. Our project put the grid back, took all the towers down, put the grid back, kept the arches, made them so that you can actually see them properly. We took away the car park, we put fantastic landscaping in, and crisscrossed it with the walkways which people want to get from one side to the other. And we actually kept that arch in such a way people actually think we built it as a folly. You know, it's just quite extraordinary. But we actually, again, stitched back the local geometry that was there before the London Wall. We tried to work with the London Wall itself. You know, some parts of it had been crenellated in the Victorian times to make it look more castle-like, you know, which is ridiculous. So we sort of restated all of that and put it back together. I think the difference between us and our generation now, you know, not much, well, man is much younger than me, of course, but you know, we have, as I say, go right back to, we have a very big social conscience to get these things right. We're not going to go and knock Borough Market down. None of us would knock that down. I mean, maybe the previous generation would, but not,
I mean,
not my
Amanda, you're
generation.
bloody old nostalgic if you don't knock it down.
I've never tried to knock Borough Market down. I think it's, you know, you've got to take, as I say, people love the sort of, you know, special places which have character, you know, like this building we're actually in, you know, we're not trying to sort of fight against that. And maybe the time, you know, after the Second World War, there was a lot of, you know, Corbusian planning. It's all a desert anyway. Let's knock it all down and start again. But I think that's the case nowadays. You know, we do preserve things. We do conserve things. We do look after things. We do try and build around them because we have this social conscience.
There's lots of great adaptive reuse in this city, which means taking classic buildings, adding modern parts to them, reusing them, converting factories, converting old schools and sheds into different things, and that's great. But in the bigger picture is that if London wants to develop as a key capital city and win its fair share of investment and be a great place to live, then we need a bigger picture, which means that certain areas have to be redlined and decided where we're going to develop, and giving developers or landowners a benefit for building great things and producing public realm, but it has to be a win-win.
Well, all I'm saying is the city you see today, and the city you're defending as having character and personality, is a city that was the result of a great battle that's taken place since the 1970s over what should be saved and what shouldn't be saved. Yeah. What has been saved was saved against fierce arguments that you're standing in the way of progress. I mean, it really was at times quite bloody. And it's happening right now. I mean, there are towers going up over Notting Hill. I mean, is it appropriate to disband a conservation area which had been statutorily set up? You know, these battles are continuing and continuing and continuing. And what upsets me, I remember when St Pancras Station reopened in 2009. The Queen was there, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra was there, dry ice was there, steam engines were there. It was a sensational evening. In the front row of the VIPs were all the people who'd been trying for 20 years to demolish the station. Right, yeah. Now, you know, that's cynicism. And I just don't buy into it. Yeah. It has got to be a balance, but we haven't got the balance right yet. And I don't think it's about the future of the city. We just know if you make a city habitable, which includes using the old buildings in the city, it's probably going to be profitable. Soho was going to be wiped out. Soho today has got one of the highest retail floor revenues in Europe because it was saved. If we made it like the Barbican, which it was going to be, it would not have been saved. Do you really want that to be like the Barbican rather than Soho now? These battles have to be fought.
Can I say the Barbican is one of the most successful housing developments. It is only recently, in the last 10 years, become loved in the way that it is now. There are, to get a flat in the Barbican, there's a waiting list. Families have come to the Barbican. There are huge communal green spaces, there are shared spaces, there are local amenities. The one thing that it doesn't really do is connect very well to the rest of the city, because it was a very young architectural practice. It was a kind of utopian thinking, and it creates a kind of a sort of island. But it's a hugely successful modern housing
It's half
development.
empty.
It is not. The Barbican is not half
I was
empty.
there. I was there.
You're
I was there.
just wrong.
I was sitting there in the middle of a lovely summer evening. There wasn't a single person in the garden. Must have been any place in Europe when no one's in the garden.
Ken, could you build something better in that location? That's the question.
In the Barbican?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could. I mean, I'm absolutely sure we could.
On that happy note, let's get the audience in. Who'd like to ask a question? Right? First hand up there, yes.
I've been really thrilled to hear the architects on the panel talk about balance so much. And I think if anyone who lives in central London and drives through it will be so often seeing fascias of really uninteresting old buildings propped up so that something you can go behind it when they actually should come down. And this sort of notion of towers over Notting Hill and conservation areas shouldn't be thrown aside, it's so black and white. Conservation areas have done an amazing amount of good, but they're also taken to the nth degree. Yeah. And instead of being able to go down a road and see something crisp and delicious and new that puts into contrast the old and plays with it, we have this nonsense of preserving every bit of old cack in order to have some nostalgic view of London.
You're absolutely right.
Very well put.
Very well put.
The trouble is, your old hack is my lovely old house. There's one here, yes. Lady there. Could you just give your name when you yeah, thank you.
My name is Tanya. A quick question. I would like to know your opinion about the proposal of turning the Oxford Street into a pedestrian zone. Yeah. It's a lot of arguments about that.
I'm sure that it's only a matter of time. And it's extremely disappointing that the initiative to pedestrianise it, which was very ambitious and it was meant to happen very quickly, has been thwarted by Westminster. But I think it's just a matter of biding our time a little.
I think that there is a clear pathway to that happening, and I think that it will be pedestrianised east-west, with the exception of certain routes that will go north-south. So the buses won't go along Oxford Street, but they will cross it in certain areas. So it's largely going to be pedestrianised and quite soon. If I could just come back to your point about conservation areas, I agree wholeheartedly. And there is a wrinkle in the law on conservation areas, which says basically you can't pull anything down, you can't do anything, unless you're producing a building of sufficient architectural merit. Now, the problem is that along comes a man who's called the council design officer, who's going to opine on it, and that's generally a man, I hope there aren't any here, a man who can't get a job in architecture, so he's become a council design officer, and he's opining as to whether your building's good enough to be in the conservation area, and that is a fundamental problem.
Okay. Yes, I can't see. Are there any waving at the back?
Just to say, I think on the car
yes.
point, I think it's just worth saying I don't think there will be any cars in London in a few years' time. It'll just be car free, and I think that's I think Oxford Street will go car free at some point. I live in Westminster, and he went to a local vote basically. I mean, this is the national high street. He goes to a local vote. I think it was 100 people or 1,000 people who voted against it, who are local people, and that's great for local democracy. But in terms of being a national high street, it didn't seem fair that 100 local people stopped it.
Yes.
My name's Edward. What's crisp and delicious is actually more often ugly and banal. If you drive on through Acton on the A40 out of London now, there's about a mile on the south side of brand new housing developments, which are of no architectural merit whatsoever. How do we stop that being repeated?
By demanding that the planners demand that there is a certain quality. Now, a lot of this is very subjective, so it's difficult. But I rather facetiously argued some time ago that there ought to be, if there was a kind of elite of architects who are internationally accepted as being of excellence, and developers' clients use those architects, then there perhaps is some way that you can offer a carrot in development. I don't mean just doing something bigger, but maybe an easier route or a quicker route through planning. It doesn't stand a hope in hell of happening, but and I'm not quite sure how you do it, but somebody has to have a look at the planning system, and I agree, those developments are so poor, so bad, and that's why I say, at least 80% of what gets built now is not good.
That was all built to a price because it's mainly social housing, and it's land which was owned by the city, I think by the central government, because it was appropriated for the widening of the road. And then when the road didn't happen, no one knew what to do with it, so they thought they'd put as many houses on as they could.
But in France, social housing often goes to young architects who put their heart and soul into it, and it's innovative, and it's
could have been done.
It could have been. It's not about money; it's about attitude.
I genuinely think the heart of the problem is simply the quality of planning, and that's the quality of planning staff. It starts there. Because planning committees tend to take a lead from their officers, tend to, not always, but they tend to. And if you haven't got a consensus of opinion in favour of what I call a balance, all these things we're talking about, you're not going to get a good decision, and that's been the problem. Yes, lady here. And at the back there, yes.
On a small scale, my name is Mimi, and at the dying high streets, which we all pass through London, through the suburbs, through the whole country, most of those shops have got residential accommodation above them. Can you see a time when that residential accommodation will take over the shops, and the yellow lines will be painted out, and those streets will be family-occupied streets where the children play football in the street?
Well, maybe.
I think if you look at how high streets developed, 100 years ago it was the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and a bunch of houses. And so they expanded, and as they expanded, they can similarly contract. But for sure, there will be elements of it, but I do think that we need to preserve our high streets for the communities.
You do, and I'm of the generation that remember playing in the street as a child, and that's what you did. But if you suck the kind of the life out of a city, there are no shops. So where you don't go to the newsagent, you don't go to the butcher, you have to get in your car to go shopping. I mean, that's not a That's not a way of living either. So you have to...
wallowing in nostalgia here.
But you allow me no way out.
I was going to add, actually, I chair something called the Future Spaces Foundation. One of our reports was about the future of the high street. And we concluded, in fact, that we need to shrink them linearly, almost, to put them back to residential on the ends to make them shorter, to more consolidate all the shops into one area, and also to get some other uses, to get universities, for instance, to have student tutoring going on in these sort of vacant shops, but also new uses like 3D printing to make jewellery, all sorts of new things to come into the high street. But at the moment, what's actually happening is Amazon and the likes are building massive warehouses outside of town. The shops are dying, and everybody's coming in these little white vans, clogging up London's infrastructure, delivering everybody's Amazon parcels. And
Amazon might start opening little shops where you can go and look at your products.
Yeah, it's just showrooms.
Well, they have started.
And using 3D printing to make the things you're getting in the shop, even the food eventually, probably.
When you're paying £40,000 a year rent for a shop the size of a bedroom, making homemade chocolates.
The problem is that in the open market, rent may well go down, and in many areas they're down 50%, but property taxes have gone up, not down. They don't get revised down very frequently.
It's the government's fault.
Always the government's fault.
There's someone up there, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether the Garden Bridge plans should have been scrapped.
Oh, come on. Go on, be controversial.
Okay, all right. I mean, I didn't like the Garden Bridge. For two reasons. One, I didn't like the idea that it could be closed for several days in the year. Just conceptually, that's completely wrong. But also, I thought it was conceptually ill-conceived. The bridges are, first of all, there was no transport imperative for that bridge. There was no need for a bridge there. There are needs for a bridge in other parts of the river, but not there. And we have, in London, some of the most fabulous parks in the world. Why do we need a park on the bridge when it would obstruct views from other parts of the river? Because the structure of the bridge was so deep to take the soil that you'd need for the trees. And the drawings that were produced, I'm really going for it now, the drawings that were produced were really quite a deceit, because there's no way that the height of the trees that they showed could flourish with the depth. So, you'd have bushes and a few low trees and huge obstruction of views of London. And some of the best views of London are along the river.
I quite liked it, to be honest, and I supported it.
You're a thrusting modernist.
I felt the biggest problem we're going to have is making the trees grow because of the desiccation from the wind going down the river. I mean, you think of a bridge with even a hanging basket on it, it is brown. So I think getting the trees to grow is always going to be a big issue. Amanda's right, didn't really go anywhere. That was the other problem. But the real problem with it, they asked for public money.
Yeah, that's right. I think, a nice idea, pretty pictures, but actually no real reason for it, and other places to spend the money.
I love the bridge. It was in the wrong place. It should have been up the Battersea Park or the Royal Horticultural Society garden down to Nine Elms, which desperately needs a bit of enlivening. That was the place to put it, not where it was going to be. Next question. Any more? Any more? Can't see any hands. Sorry? Oh, there is, yes. Right in the dark, yeah.
My name's Margaret. I have had a business in Shoreditch for over 15 years, and I agree that there needs to be balance. I've seen the area change dramatically with buildings and high-rises, and I'd just like to know, when does community get involved with these plannings and these buildings? Because a lot of that community has been pushed out. The artists have been pushed out, a lot of the small business owners, and I'd like to see more of a balance within that.
And I think that in these cases, it's a matter for the local government, local council, to set aside certain areas for small businesses and to protect them, and for you to have your rights in terms of the planning process, which you do. But there will always be progress, and you can't, and areas change and develop. So, developers have always made money at the end of the day by trying to think where the next area will be. And so there is an element of modernization and people moving. But there needs to be, I agree with you, some protection for existing businesses.
I mean, there is, in every job there's consultation. I mean, I can't think of a project where we haven't actually had a public exhibition. We have the tools now to show what a project's going to look like, the computer tools, models, incredible, facilities we didn't actually have back in the economist days, where we could lie about what it looked like. We can't do that anymore. There's no hiding place anymore. These computers show exactly what it's going to look like. And so, we have the tools and we use them. We have public exhibitions all the time. Doing a small village hall down in the Wiltshire, and we had about 500 people turn up to public consultation. It was absolutely massive input, and then we just change the design a little bit, move it along a bit. So I think you do have a say. I mean, if your house is being knocked down and you're being moved to one of Ian's new areas, I think that is progress. But I think at the end of the day, we do consult, and you have rights to consult, and we try and make sure we do that.
But we talked about an example where actually local democracy and community had a negative impact in being able to thwart the plans for pedestrianising Oxford Street. So I think sometimes it's, who is the community? Is it just the people who live and work in the immediate vicinity? Or actually, is it a much wider group of people, the people who walk past, the tourists, the visitors, the people who enjoy streets but aren't directly connected. And you know, in a sense, as architects, we have to design for all of those people.
Well, the status of existing generation is what you're talking about, and it's very, very difficult to make a decision on that. Most people who live in the country or have a cottage in the country or whatever are fanatically conservative. They want the local people to decide everything. They don't want anyone to mess up their village. It's beautiful as it is. Kindly get lost. Move them to the city, and they're wildly, you know, Amanda-like. They say, progress has got to take place. Get rid of all this crap, you know, smash it to the ground. We've got to live with tomorrow because you said it. But I mean, there has to be. I guess, awful word. I mean, it's Socratic. There has to be a balance. Yeah. But it's most difficult if you take a place like Shoreditch, and you could replicate that in North Kensington or in Bermondsey, New Cross, all across London. These old working class districts that have been hit, I mean, really hit by the blitz of progress. And the only decision they can really make is to try and protect the old houses. I mean, other than that, it's the goner. What status you give to the local electorate at one moment in time to determine what should be the long-term future of the city is really problematic. Jane Jacobs, when she was studying this in New York, I mean, famously, accorded to the people who lived in Greenwich Village when she was living in Greenwich Village, absolute veto power on the future of Greenwich Village. Now, that wasn't going to help the future of New York. I mean, I totally buy into that. And I just do think in cities you have less rights, probably, to obstruct progress than you would have in a country village. But that itself is controversial. Any last question? Yes, one at the back.
Thank you. Alexander. May I ask, somewhat controversially, moving outside of cities, and right now we have within half a mile of here, as Ian will know, 1,000 houses, which I somewhat reconciled will be built in Bourne End. How do you see the country providing the government sort of 300,000 objective of houses? Are these to be affordable? And if so, compulsory acquisition of agricultural land? And also, are we going to look at prefabricated SIPs, Scandinavian kit-built houses to achieve the affordable, maybe £200,000 per house might be possible, because there seems to be such a demand on housing with the growing population. Thank you.
I'm not convinced there's really a shortage of land that's suitable for development without going into the green belt. And I can give you a very quick example, which is that my business owns some land which was permitted for a big health club, a David Lloyd club, and we didn't build it. But it was permitted, and it was considered not to be green belt. It was on the edge of town, actually, in Hertfordshire. And no one objected. The council wanted it to come forward for housing. We wanted it to. The regional authorities, the planning authorities, all were in favour, but it needed a change in the regional plan, which needed a public inquiry. 7.5 years later, we're still waiting for the result of that. No one said a single word against it. There's no ecological issues. It's perfect. It will produce 350 homes, which are desperately needed. And it was due to be approved at governmental level, actually about 2 weeks ago. A new housing secretary came in and said, I want to review all the plans again. I'll put them all on hold for another few months while I look at it. So I think it's a process issue rather than a land issue.
Last word.
I mean, I was going to say the same sort of thing. I don't think we actually need to build over the greenbelt. I think there's lots of vacant land within cities at the moment which we could build on. If you look, go to Birmingham, my hometown, look across Birmingham, it's very low density. It is very, very low density. And you could build higher in certain areas and get the density up. We don't want a Los Angeles. We want it to be more compact, more green areas, and make the cities much more compact. So from my view, is, don't build in the green belt, don't do garden cities, don't do satellites, just put everything into the cities we actually do have and make them denser.
But I do think we should maybe just, because it hasn't been reviewed for a very long time, review where the green belt is, because there are areas of the green belt that frankly feel like kind of brownfield sites. They are not prime green belt. So why, let's redefine where the green belt is. Be brave, not, hide behind, oh, we can't go beyond the green belt, because I do think there are areas that are ripe for development.
Well, if you redevelop London at the density of Paris, I'm a part of the high density movement, you double the population of London. You wouldn't need to go anywhere else. London is so low density, and I'm not for conserving every muse, two-storey muse. Two-storey muses in central London are crazy, I think. So I'm with the progress lobby. But there's...
So you'd knock them all down?
I'd allow 2 stories on every one. Yeah. That's doubling the size of most of them. They really would. And I mean, the number of brownfield sites and little bits and pieces all over central London where you could build something really, impressive, 8 stories high without ruining the skyline is infinite. It can all be done. And the same applies to the countryside. There's so much of the countryside you can build on, which won't destroy countryside. The green belt is absurd in one sense. It's just all we've got. That's why we're so fierce to defend it. But anyway, it's all the government's fault. On that happy note, thank you very much for coming.